of parallel lines to the projections of Desargues' theorem and into the splines that are regulated through the straight lines tangent to those curves in our computational software. We're going to pick up where we left off, and I'm going to draw 4 lines here. All right? Paintbrush. Pencil. Magnetic filings caught in my son Jasper's drawing instrument. And Rhino. I always like to remember when I first had my first job, and I told them I knew AutoCAD. I didn't know AutoCAD, and I called up my friend Dan Paris the night before, and he said, "Don't worry, Mike, L is line." And that was all I needed to go on the first day. So here we have 4 lines. We have a painted line, a drawn line, this line which is the attraction filings to the surface, and then this line here in Rhino. Now, if we're all just going to call these things signs that signify something like edge or intersection of 2 planes, then I think we're good to go. We can call them all lines. But since this is a discussion of mediation, and since the assumption is that the changing nature of mediation affects the ways in which we design things, conceptually think of them, and aesthetically judge them, we're going to need to ask this question a little bit differently. And in order to aid our discussion, we're going to bring up Walter Benjamin's little text on painting, the sign and the mark, and the difference that he distinguishes between a drawing and a painting. And it says some strange and interesting things about the difference between a line and a mark, between a drawing and a painting. So if we view this one, which was the pencil line on the piece of paper, I don't know if I need to hold this up, but it's beautiful in all of its glory as a line. One of the things that Walter Benjamin says about this is that this line binds and bounds to its ground, that it creates a ground, that it is of necessity demarcating itself in relationship to that ground. As opposed to the mark, the painted line in this case, in Walter Benjamin's description, is not a line at all, but is something more akin to an emergent condition out of the ground, that within a painting there is no ground. The marks are just different variations between color, and that those colors then emerge out of a matrix. If we think about those distinctions, if we accept them for the time being in terms of our discussion, we begin to think of some very different things in terms of the ways in which we would treat these computational lines as lines. First thing I want to look at here is, this is a line I've drawn in Rhinoceros, and you probably already know a few things about it that are quite different than the other lines that I've just drawn. First, I'll zoom in to it pretty much to infinity, and it's not going to get bigger or smaller. That's rather interesting. If I copy it, I can repeat it again and again and again. Or in other ways, the thing to say about that is that I can grab it like an object and I can move it. Now, that's a rather different condition. That's not a line that's fixed to a ground, and that's not a mark emerging from a matrix. That's a thing, an object in a way, in a space. I can rotate it, I can copy it, I can change it, I can move it about in that world. It is actually not a line graphic nor a mark in terms of painting, but it's actually an abstract entity of geometry. It's a vector. And as such, then I can control it as a vector. But there's one other line here, actually, which is this line, which was that line now PDF'd and then rasterized and brought into Photoshop. And if I think about this one, as I zoom in on it, I start to notice something very different at a certain scale as I approach that line. It's a series of pixels, pixels illuminated in their variation between hue, saturation, and intensity. It is actually very close to the magnetic filings that have been attracted to the surface of this kid's toy. This, in many ways, is more akin to that computational line than this graphic mark drawn on the piece of paper or the vector upon which I was operating just a moment ago in Rhino. All these little gray lines, we know they're called anti-aliasing, and I don't know exactly the technical algorithms that go about in terms of the smoothing of this, but I like the idea that somehow the line is aliased as if it was its false identity, and then you anti-alias it to make it look more like the real line, as if we could walk around and have anti-aliases ourselves as if they were our real names as opposed to our code names. I think that's kind of funny. So the one thing I want to bring out is that in terms of that rastered image, in terms of that PDF, in terms of that visualization of the line, it's actually much closer to what Walter Benjamin would call the mark. And it is exactly that. It is exactly not the demarcation of ground. It is a ground that is all variations of illumination. It's a ground that's all variations of conditions of luminosity, saturation, and hue. And that what we're actually doing often when we're working in a digital model and then judging and evaluating that which is rasterized to our screens, because all of our visualizations are rasterized to our screens, whether we print them out or look at them through a monitor, is actually we're judging something closer to a painting. So in a very odd way now, we have an abstract geometry of lines which are modeled as vectors in space, which we then use surfaces and volumes, yet we're judging them as rasterized illuminations of marks within a groundless condition of the monitor or the printout. So line as drawing is gone. And in a very odd way, we're working somehow between a model and a painting. Now, this in some light has to change the way in which we conceptually and aesthetically via painting judge the work that we're doing through our mediations as architects. As we know the classical distinctions between the linear and the painterly, that the line demarcates edge, the line is that which bounds through its contour, where's my pencil? Bounds through its contour the difference between inside and outside. And we have, you know, the tradition of Dubutati's tracing, here my hand, not that Dubutati's traced her hand, but she traced her lover's visage going off to war, and then her father came around and made a sculpture of that, and then he was there, and after he was dead, they had a sculpture by which to remember him. But that contour, bound to the ground of the wall through the projection of light via either a torch or the sun, was the binding difference between what is inside and what is outside, the line, the contour, demarcating it on the ground. With painting, it's an incredibly different condition. The paint is not in any way, shape, or form the bounding contour. In fact, actually, I'm going to do this with this. This is a liquid pigment, and I'm going to use the liquid pigment because it kind of sets up thicker. There we go. So now we have Dubutati's liquid pigmenting the visage of her lover. You know, even though it looks in some way like somehow I've gone through the same process of demarcating contour, I'm really situating differentiations of marks on boundaries. And conditions. And each of those pixels then is able to be controlled. If I had a gray pigment, I could come in here and anti-alias my hand, but I don't. And each of these then allows us to discretely operate on constant variations of gradients of illumination. And that's actually what we're doing when we work on a raster image. We are working within the gradients of variation of illumination. If we want to make edge, we drive the threshold between two different pixels over a certain range, and we get to have a visual edge. but there is actually no edge there. Each of those in their own separate way are working within the realms of the painting. So, how I think this then forces us to think differently about our mediation is present in a couple drawings that I have brought of my own. I'm going to hold this one up here, and somehow it, as a physical object, then has presence in scale. And if this then makes sense in terms of the time, we can go to that other image that's been in the background. What these things are for me explorations of a hybrid condition between drawing, painting, and photography. They're made of lines and only lines. There's just several 100,000 of them. And they're varying constantly within their color range and within their layers and levels of intensity. Yet there's only lines. There's nothing that is not linear. So at some level, we have to call this a drawing. It exists in its abstract creation in Rhino as a two-dimensional entity. So it is a piece of geometry conceptually. Yet when I'm looking at it, when I'm working on it, and when I'm thinking about it, the only questions I'm asking myself are painterly questions. How do I lose and gain an edge? When and where do I push and pull through depth? How do I begin to define a color field of a dynamic that moves against and with and through the emergent body that is there? It's not a figure defined through its bounding contour, but a figure that's defined through its variation across the field. And for me, these are the starts of an aesthetic exploration of this hybrid condition that's somewhere in between drawing, modeling, and painting. And that's session 2.